Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. On Perpetual Chess, I have weekly conversations with the chess world's best players, promoters, and educators about their lives, careers, current projects, and best practices. For more information, go to perpetualchesspod.com. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to Perpetual Chess. So before I introduce today's guest, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who has donated to the show. Things have been a little crazy at home for me lately with the kids and work and holidays and all that. So making a bit of money for all my efforts makes a big difference, and I'm having a blast and looking forward to some great guests coming up, starting with today's guest. So today's guest is someone I and a lot of American, in particular, chess players, but global chess players have been a fan of for a long time. Chess author, historian, and player, of course, and trainer, International Master John Donaldson. John, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Ben.
So, John, for those who don't know, is just getting out of about a 6-year rabbit hole along with his friend, International Master Eric Tangborn. They've been writing biographies and analyzing games of a certain chess player named Bobby Fischer. So John and Eric and I have been in touch for a bit, waiting for them to finish this project, this immense project. And about a month ago, they released what I believe is their final ebook, and I've been reading through it, and it's amazing. So that's going to be the first thing we talk about. So congratulations on finishing, John.
Well, thank you. I for a while, I wasn't sure it was going to end. Yeah,
I think that a lot of authors end up feeling that way.
Yeah, I think the thing with Fischer is just that, you know, there's always something more you can learn about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of my main takeaways from this book, because I'm obviously not as well versed. I mean, of course, I'm a fan of chess, so I know the broad brushstrokes of his career, but you guys know a ton, and you were born, you're part of the Fischer generation. So why don't you tell the listeners about that a little bit, just to let them know what angle you're coming from.
Well, I was living in Tacoma, Washington, a city about 30 miles south of Seattle, and in the fall of 1972, there was this, late summer, fall, there was this match in Reykjavik, and all my friends in the neighborhood, we all followed it very avidly, but, we were like just beginning players. And then all of a sudden I saw an announcement for the Tacoma Chess Club, and like many chess clubs all over the United States at the time, they were experiencing a real boom in membership. And that's where I first met Eric Tangborn and several other people who continue to be my friends today after, 40-odd years. So, I mean, it would be hard to describe to people today what it was like back in 1972, because it wasn't just Fischer as a chess player, but it was Fischer as like an international phenomenon.
Yeah, that was something that struck me in the book. I don't know if you agree with this assessment, but one thing that I mean, there's so much to talk about from the book, but there was an excerpt from Lou Hayes, and you guys have a lot of interesting primary sources throughout the book, but Lou Hayes, who got to know Fischer a little bit in his later years, said that in 1972, he thought that Fischer was not just the most famous chess player, but possibly the most famous person in the world, and that kind of rocked my world. That really put things in perspective for me.
Right. Well, I mean, when I ran across the image of him playing tennis with Gail Goodrich, and then I started to research it, and I realized that there's this newspaper article, and it talks about Joe Frazier and the great boxer who fought Muhammad Ali several times. He's asking Bobby Fischer for his autograph, and he's not the only sports star that's doing this. It kind of puts things in perspective.
Yeah, and O.J. Simpson was in that tournament too, right?
Indeed he was.
When he was famous, but not infamous.
Most definitely.
And Fischer as well, I guess, was famous but not infamous yet, sad to say.
Yes.
So let's zoom out a little bit, John. The first words, so I'm going to come clean, as I always do with my guests, about what I have and have not read. So I read both biographies. So you guys wrote, you've written about, is it 5 books? I mean, you've written some before then, but in your collaborations with Eric, how many books have you written about Fischer?
Well, there was one print book, and that came out in around 2000, and it was kind of just a small taste of what was going to come. But what we've really been working on the last 5 years years was 5 books, which are all now available on Kindle.
Okay, good. I didn't want to misspeak, but that's what I thought. And so, like I said, just to come clean, I read the 2 that were the biographies. I read the most recent 2, leading up to, what was the cutoff year?
62 is where the first year ends, and then it starts in 63 for the next.
Right. So I read the early years and the later years, and I didn't get a chance to go through the chess, but obviously as a chess player, I'm reasonably well versed in what a genius he was. So my first question is the first question that you pose in the 4th volume. And by the way, these are all available on Kindle, and they're cheap. They're a huge bargain considering that you guys have been working on these for 6 years. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I really recommend that everyone check them out. You will definitely learn something. But the first thing you say, getting back to the question, is why another Fischer book? So why don't you tell our listeners what drove you to spend 6 years on this project?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you go to Edward Winter's site, he's got a special section reserved for books on Bobby Fischer. And there's over 100 titles. And they cover all aspects of his career. And if you look at Frank Brady with Profile of Prodigy, 2 different editions, with Endgame, and more recently with Joseph Ponoroto, who did a psychobiography of Bobby Fischer that he had access to a lot of family papers through Russell Targ. A lot of stuff on Fischer is already known. But after reading the books by Frank Brady, and I was a proofreader for for Endgame, I realized there were like a lot of unanswered questions, and I always like to know. I like to try to find out the answers to things. And just to give one example, in 1965, Bobby Fischer played at the Marshall Chess Club, and all chess players know about how he couldn't travel to Cuba, and he had to play by teletype. And there was the one game, and the game was against Victor Cecoltea of Romania. I'm probably butchering his name. Apologies.
I always butcher everyone's name on this podcast, so so you wouldn't be welcome if you got it right.
Okay. Well, Cecoltea, he was known to be like, a sort of very systematic player, and he always played e4 as white. And all of a sudden, there's this question because Fischer, in response to e4, played knight f6. And he would play the Alekhines defense many times later in his career, but up to that point, he had never played it. He had always answered e4 with either c5, his main choice, or there was a brief period where he was like really into classical chess and he answered e4 with e5. So the question was like, what exactly happened? Did he actually intend to play Alekhines defense? And there have been various theories that maybe it was a transmission error, or maybe he did just intend to play Alekhines defense. And so I was able to contact 3 or 4 people that were actually present when it was there. And it turns out, indeed, there was a transmission error. And the first move that was played was d4. And, Fischer played knight f6, no surprise there. But a little bit later, when e4, e5 was played, the operators in New York realized there was a problem. And so, they explained to Fischer, there's this issue, should we go back and have them start the game from the beginning? Because they drafted regulations for this teletype chess, but they were, they didn't cover all things like this. And Fischer just waved off. He said, no problem. I'll play Alekhines defense. Now today, when all top players seem to play seemingly every opening, it'd be no big deal. But in those days, that was not something that was very common, that you would see somebody willing to play an opening that really wasn't part of their repertoire. But Fischer, he knew pretty much everything about everything. He didn't have a problem with that. So that was like one of the questions that we wanted to answer. But there were a lot of other ones. And one of them was, why did Fischer, why did he stop playing after 1972? And what was it that caused him to just become sort of more bitter, if you will? And we think we found a reasonable explanation in part for why that happened, and that was namely the lawsuit with Brad Derrick. And he had Derrick's signed signature. Derrick, by the way, was the fellow that had written a series of articles for Time Magazine, for Life, on Bobby. He had earned his trust in the match with Petrosian, the final candidates match. He was a very well-known journalist. He had written about Marilyn Monroe. He had written about Jackie Gleason. And Fischer's lawyer at the time thought that he could meet two things Bobby was looking for. One was that Bobby, certainly at that time after the match, after winning like $1,000 against Larson and another $1,000 previous to that against Taimanov, he could use some money, and I think he got like $2,500 for agreeing to cooperate with Derek. But he also, I think, Fischer was never really totally motivated by money. In fact, I don't think that was his primary driving force. But what he was interested in was having chess treated with respect, and he realized that for a lot of people didn't really know a lot about chess, if they saw that there's a lot of money behind it, that he could realize it must be important. And so he signed on to this deal with Derek, but not without some reservations. He had gotten burned by Ralph Ginsburg back in the early 1960s and been very wary of journalists. So he took a couple steps with the advice of his lawyer, and one was he had Derek sign a contract, and basically Derek said, I will not use any of the materials that I gather for anything but magazine articles. It will not be used for a book. And he signed that at least on one occasion, possibly twice. And Harry Benson, the photographer, heard him say it to Bobby Fischer orally. Frank Brady did as well. So there's no question that Derek made this implicit promise that he, and more than implicit, he just basically said, I won't write a book. But of course he did write a book. And in the book he did not put Bobby in a very favorable light, and Bobby really got angry, and he just thought, hey, this is going to be like a slam dunk. I'm going to win because, this guy signed the contract. He wouldn't write a book, and he did. But the problem for Bobby was that the law is a lot more complicated than that, and that was especially true in the early 1970s when the public's right to know was starting to evolve as a legal doctrine. And so what ended up happening is ultimately what happened is Fischer did not get satisfaction at all. And he didn't really get it in part because he automatically thought he would just get a day in court. But that's not the way the U.S. legal system works. First, the judge has the lawyers from the two sides depose the plaintiff and defendant. And in Fischer's case, I've seen some of the depositions. They're in the possession of a fellow Larry Finley that's down in Long Beach that bought some of Bobby's items that were auctioned off after the Beacons episode. And it makes it very clear that Fischer cooperated initially with the depositions, but like after a day or two, these things do not go quickly, and Fischer just kind of got frustrated with the whole thing. And so the judge dismissed his request to file a lawsuit for the reason not that it was deemed to be not worthy, but just simply he hadn't continued long enough in the process. So he could have reopened that. But even if he had, it's not clear that Fischer would have won for two reasons. One is that at that point, Fischer was an extremely public figure. Public's right to know could have superseded the contract that Derek signed. And the other thing about it is that Fischer had asked for a large amount of money. If you do all the math, he was asking for about $20 million in damages, and that really would have been more or less impossible to have shown to a judge and jury how he came to that amount. If he had asked for a lesser amount, I think that he might and he'd gone through the depositions, he might have been successful. So that's just one example of like how we kind of went into the bunny hole and barely dug our way out.
Right. Yeah. And one thing I think most listeners will know this, but I've had some friends who've had articles written about them, and they're not Bobby Fischer. They're not world famous. And people do misrepresent things. It happens all the time. I mean, like writers take creative license. They sacrifice story for truth. So it's not at all hard to believe. And I mean, you documented in your book. I mean, it wasn't a fair characterization. So of Bobby Fischer. So whereas later, obviously, he deserved the reputation that he had. At this point in life, I mean, the guy breached the contract that they had, went back on his word, and didn't represent him fairly. So this made, as you guys posit, quite a mark on him, and really might have altered the trajectory of his persona and career.
Yeah, well, the problem was that Fischer took it directly as a failure of the U.S. government. He thought it was like the U.S. legal system that had failed him. So when you see him spit on the document from the State Department in 1992, this is just a sort of continuation of his belief that the U.S. government was out to get him, and the fact that he didn't have a visit to the White House in 1972. All these things sort of rolled up together, along with some, shall we say, slippery mental health. All these things, didn't make for a good situation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's possible to be both paranoid and have lots of people, out to get you, or at least misrepresenting you.
Yes.
So zooming out a little bit, I mean, obviously we're going to talk more about Bobby Fischer in detail, but in terms of talking about like the project, when you and Eric started this 6 years ago, I mean, there were unanswered questions, and you've named a few of them, and there are several more really interesting discussions in the book. But like, did you have the scope of this project in mind at the beginning, or like what were you envisioning when you guys started?
Well, I sort of had conceptually an idea that the first two volumes would be an attempt. I mean, the first thing I should say is that in doing this project, we didn't want to repeat what other people had already done as much as possible. I mean, there's really no point to that. So the first two volumes, the idea was to try to chronicle and collect and preserve as many of his non-tournament games as possible. And we'd sort of started off. I wrote a book in the mid-'90s called Legend on the Road, and it was about Bobby Fischer's tour around the United States in 1964. There's a second edition of that book that was the first one was published by Yasser Seirawan's Inside Chess, and it was maybe, I maybe gathered like 100 games, and then it greatly expanded for the second edition under Hannon Russell. He put that out, and maybe that was like in the early 2000s or so, I would guess. And but I wanted to go beyond that, and I found a lot more exhibitions, add more games, more notes. So that was, part of what was in the first book. But the second one was really kind of unknown territory, and Fischer gave a fair number of exhibitions around the world, but they're just scattered. And in particular, one that was really important that we really wanted to focus on was the exhibitions that he gave after his match with Petrosian. And that was about a month-long tour, and it was known about, and Fischer, we know, thought about it very highly, because when he had his possessions auctioned off after the Beacons affair, he mentioned specifically that he had carbons of all the score sheets of all the games that he played during that tour. And, what happened to them? Well, we still don't know to this day. They're not with David DeLucia, the great chess collector, particularly of Fischer memorabilia. They're not at the World Chess Hall of Fame where the Rex Sinkfield Bobby Fischer collection is. They're not with Larry Finley, who picked up a lot of items of Bobby Fischer. So exactly what happened to them is not known. And it was interesting. Fischer, he, as his wont, he kind of inflated their value. He estimated it was like millions and millions of dollars. But what we do know after reconstructing the tour was that he gave approximately 20 exhibitions, and each of those exhibitions he had a fixed number of boards. He would only play 20 boards. It was much different than 1964. And these players were typically Class A to Master Strength. And as he said in some of the interviews he gave in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Argentinian players were not particularly well versed in theory, but they were good practical players, and he found that if he didn't beat them in the opening or get a huge edge, that it was going to be a long night. And so he played very sharply and very cunningly and very instructively to sort of read between the lines of what he said. And he said these games were really important, and I wish I knew what these game scores were. What we were able to verify was that they did use carbons for all the exhibitions, and Fischer got the top half of the carbons. So, it's hard to say. I mean, after 40 years, they should still be good, if they were stored in a normal situation. And one only hopes that they weren't thrown out when before the auction, when all of Fischer's items were tallied. So that was the structure of the first two books, and part of the idea in doing it was that we expect that people will find more games of his in the future, and when they do, they'll have some sort of framework in which to put these games. They'll know where the exhibitions were played, what the dates were, what his results were. And it's important to have those results because sometimes you want to, you want to be able to find a way to verify that the games are actually legitimate and not just, some fabrication, although that doesn't seem to be the case very often. The third book is nothing but his writings. And I should say first off, the idea there was to make writings of his that were relatively or very inaccessible available to the reader. And so you won't find 60 Memorable Games, a copyrighted book that has a zillion different editions out. That won't be found there. And but what you will find is the articles that he annotated a lot of games for a lot of different magazines in a lot of different languages, and we put all those together. And most of those were from the 60s, and Fischer always kept score in English descriptive, so we converted them over to algebraic. We made annotations to games that he didn't make annotations to, but in this case, it was more a case of just letting him speak for himself and just trying to have all that information in one place. And then, of course, there's the final two volumes, and those are more biographical in nature. And I should say one other thing, that this project, although it's primarily about Bobby Fischer, it's also about people that helped him, people that were his contemporaries, and trying to give them their due as well.
Yeah, you guys do a good job of that, and I mean, I think you and Mr. Tangborn you're kind of in the perfect situation for it, because you guys have epitomized American chess over the course of your lives, and so while you might not have had much direct interaction with him, you certainly all the players in the play. I mean, everyone, it seems, who had a role in Fischer's life and tried to help him.
Yes. I was able to speak to Frank Brady. I was able to talk to Alan Kaufman. These were people that knew Bobby when he was growing up. There was also Aben Rudy was another. And then at the very end of his life, William Lombardy came to San Francisco, and he was at the mechanics for chess club where I'm the chess director, and he basically lived at our club. I would not quite lived there, but he spent most of his waking hours there for the better part of 3 weeks, and so I had a lot of chances to ask him questions. Just to give one simple little example, in the tribute to Fischer after he died, Jan Timman wrote about a construction worker in Santa Monica that was was working in that area of the Miramar Hotel in 1966, and Tim unquotes the construction worker saying that he saw Fischer and Lombardy walking along, and they'd be talking, I'm going to beat this guy, I'm going to beat this guy. And, Fischer had the slow start, but then he had the fantastic finish there. It's a wonderful anecdote. The problem is when I asked Lombardy, he said, I wasn't in Los Angeles. Right. I was finishing my work to become a priest. Right. It's just one of those things. I mean, we don't like to shoot down great stories, but the facts are the facts.
Right. Well, I think, as you say in the book, it doesn't mean that like Fischer didn't walk by. It just means he might not have been with Lombardy.
Exactly.
Well, he wasn't with Lombardy. We now know.
Right, he might have been talking to Lombardy, but Lombardy wasn't.
Exactly. That's funny. So what else? I mean, just having seen Lombardy, I mean, the obituaries and the memorials and the good and bad of his life and career have been written up recently. What was your overall impression in getting to spend some time with him just before he passed?
He was, the first thing that listeners should know is that he got released from the hospital in the spring of last year, and he told me several times that the doctor said that he had a heart condition and that he should stay there, but he just didn't like being confined, and he didn't feel that they were treating him well, and so I don't know what his the state of his physical health was. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but it's possible that he realized at some level that he didn't have a lot of time left in his life. I don't know. But what I do know is that he was teaching at a chess camp in Iowa in August, and I think it was in Burlington, Iowa, because he saw the Amtrak train, the California Zephyr goes right through there, and he decided one day you just hop on the train. And he really didn't have, I mean, there were, of course, those of us that knew him in the Bay Area, but it was not like New York where he had all these lifelong close friends. And so he just, he took the train west, and he visited a friend in Redwood City, George Butler, that he'd corresponded with for some time but had never met. And then he ended up in San Francisco, and he'd really made no plans. He didn't really have any money, but a couple of our club members were able to take him in and give him a place to sleep and feed him. And he was in a good space when he was at our club. I mean, he was he would sometimes be a little argumentative, but for the most part he mellowed out from the kind of old Bill Lombardy that I had known in the past. The sort of person that, for example, who had sealed, adjourned games 2 queens down, against Edmar Mednes. Is
right, the famous story.
Yeah, and there's a couple others like that. I think today's top players, they play by the Marquess of Queensberry rules a lot closer than they did in the old days. They had a lot sharper elbows. But in the case of Lombardy, I think that most of the people I think pretty much all the people that wrote about him, Mr. Anderson, Andy Soltis, I think they all did a pretty good job of kind of balancing him out. I mean, they didn't. There's a tendency to speak no ill of the dead and to just kind of whitewash over their life, but then you kind of don't really get their life at all. And I don't think Bill would have wanted that either. So I think that they kind of gave a more balanced viewpoint. I mean, he was really he could be a wonderful person, but he had his dark side as well. And I don't think there was any disrespect intended in relaying that information. And just recently, I read the piece by Mark Weeder in New in Chess, and I had not realized that Lombardy, for several years, he basically had like a chess Maecenas. It was Ted Field, who's a Class A player from Los Angeles, but better known as part of the Marshall Field family. And he's a well-known Hollywood producer, and he was also one of the sponsors of the 1990 World Championship. And it turns out, from what Weeder wrote, that Lombardy he was basically taken care of, and he used that money that was given to him to pretty much live on for a long time, until ultimately the money ran out and he became short of funds, and he finally got evicted from his home. But I would say, if I were to add anything about Lombardy to what they said, is that usually people, when they want to trot out what a promising talent he was, they point to his perfect score in the World Junior and his victory in leading the U.S. team to gold in Leningrad in 1960. And it'd be hard to argue with either of those two, but I'd point out to a couple other performances. And one is he played a match in 1956 with Sammy Reshevsky. And it was a training match. It was to prepare Reshevsky for a match with David Bronstein, a match that never came about. And the match ended up 3.5, 2.5 in the favor of Reshevsky. He won the last game. The first 5 had been drawn. Lombardy missed a win in Game 5. And he was like 17 or 18 years old at the time. And Lombardy, for him to do that, you have to consider the fact that Reshevsky had never lost a match in his career up to that point. He wouldn't lose a match until he played a short one with Portage, I think around 64, 65. So for him to play on more or less even terms with a player who in that time was arguably in the top 3 or 4 in the world, that speaks for itself. I'd also point to the fact that Lombardy played board 2 for the U.S. team at the Munich Olympiad in 1958. And if you go to Olympbase, which is really a terrific site, it's like a site I probably visit almost every day, you'll find that that although Lombardy was ostensibly their board, the U.S. board 2, he played like half the tournament on board 1. And the reason for that was that Reshevsky was very devout, and he wouldn't play on Jewish high holidays, and he wouldn't play on the Sabbath. And it just happened that the dates for the Olympiad in Munich, both Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah occurred, they conflicted with the Olympiad, and so I think Reshevsky played maybe like just barely a little over 50% of the games, and Lombardy was the guy that was pulling the heavy weight. I think he missed 2 games in the whole Olympiad, and that was only because he got in a car crash in the middle of the tournament. So Lombardy, he just had a wonderful amount of stories to tell. Some of them, it was a little settling of scores, and so you had to be a little cautious. But for example, his book Understanding Chess, I mean, it's a book that anybody that's interested in U.S. chess history definitely has to read. Although they should read it, with a critical eye, because there's some points where he's definitely not fair to the people he's talking about. But that's the way he saw it. Right.
Yeah. And similar to Bobby Fischer, who he mentored and was friends with, as you guys talk about in the book, I mean, yes, he had like a bitter side to his personality, and definitely was like looking to settle some scores in his book. But he also was perhaps treated a bit unfairly. As you say, he was a huge talent, and as you talk about in the book, like the American Chess Foundation was founded basically to support Reshevsky, and Lombardy was on that level but didn't get any support, and this is a time when there were basically no chess professionals, so that pretty much was a large driver in deterring him from pursuing chess as a profession. Is that an accurate assessment, John?
I would say so. I mean, the American Chess Foundation was formed in the mid-1950s. It was a great thing that they did, because at that time the prizes for like a month-long interzonal were like $500. Even adjusting for inflation, it was like a ridiculous amount. And for somebody like Reshevsky, who had 3 children and a wife, and he was the sole breadwinner, that was asking a lot for him to go off to a tournament like that. In 55, it wasn't such an issue. Where it became a problem is when you had players that were getting to be his equal, and that would be, Fischer and Lombardy in the late 50s, and pretty much culminating in like 1960, 61, I think it was U.S. Championship, where Fischer was first, Lombardy was second, and Ray Weinstein was third. It was clear that Reshevsky was still a great player, and in international events would still really shine, but domestically he was no longer the top dog at all.
Yeah, and just for everyone who lived in New York, as I did, like when Lombardy was there, if you ever went to the Marshall, there was a good chance you would come across him, the Marshall Chess Club, that is. And I was just a 2200 nobody, but I had a day in like the late 90s where I was just at the chess club, and Lombardy was there, and we struck up a conversation and ended up going to see a movie together. Like, he was, he had his, he could be prickly, but he also he was so deeply embedded in the chess community, and like sort of felt an affinity for anyone who shared that strength or illness, depending on how you look at it. So that's my little Lombardy story. I mean, I wasn't as, like, I wish I'd known more about, like, you know, just what a legend he was at the time, because we were just, you know, just a quiet afternoon. I wasn't an interviewer, and I didn't interview him, but I'm glad that you got to spend some time with him recently.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people in New York that, of course, that knew him much better. But I would say this: when he was at the Mechanics Chess Club, we had like a lot of players that were, you know, just club players, you know, class players, and he was very friendly to them. He'd look at their games. He even played a little blitz chess. I mean, he was not a guy who put on airs, and I mean, he could be very friendly and very accessible. It was just if you got him into certain conversations, certain topics, you know, probably better to stay clear of those. But you know, the part of I think some of his bitterness came from the fact that, you know, he drew with Botvinnik twice with black in late 50s, I believe, and he played this close match with Reshevsky, and he led the U.S. to the gold medal. And then he decided to become a priest. And pretty much from like when he made that decision after taking second in the U.S. championship, from like 61 to 67, he was studying for the priesthood. And, you know, he could play on occasion. You know, he would play in U.S. Opens in the summer and things like that. But you know, the best years of his chess, those were those years, and they were gone. And so by the time he started playing again, full time, which would have been after he left the priesthood in the mid to late 70s, you know, a lot of strong players had came up, and you know, he was still very talented, but you know, it's like, you know, closer to 40, and the opportunities had passed him. Yeah,
it definitely is one of the many. What could have been stories about chess that we'll never know the answer to.
Yes.
So I want to get back to Bobby Fischer a little bit, and just for listeners, we're also going to talk about John's career. I mean, I find this Fischer stuff fascinating, and you know, I could go on for hours personally, but I've got a few questions from listeners relating to Bobby Fischer, and then of course we'll also, time permitting, want to ask John about the Mechanics Institute and the Olympiad and his books and his other books and stuff like that. So, but first, let's get to Fischer. So, one question from Sanat Singhai is, what was something really unique that you noticed about Fischer's training methods, playing style, or personality? How did he work so hard and be so focused on chess without buttoning apart from diehard passion for chess, which, of course, I don't know if I'd say without that, but you get the idea.
Yes. Well, I think that, to my mind, if I could go back in time, the place I would want to be would be Jack Collins or John Collins' apartment on Lenox Avenue, just a short distance from Erasmus High School, where Bobby attended. It was just literally around the block. Where Fischer lived on Lincoln Place was like less than a mile away from Collins' home. And I think that where Fischer really developed his deep love for chess, where he really learned, you know, so much about the game, was at Collins' home. And it's interesting because even Wider in this New in Chess interview, he repeats what had been written by Lombardy in his book, which was, you know, Collins was not Fischer's teacher. He was nobody's teacher. He wasn't a particularly strong master. He was a nice enough guy. But so true or not true? Well, there's some things you can do. One thing is you can look up the players' respective USCF ratings and look what they were when they first started working with Collins, because you have to realize that for somebody like the Byrne brothers, it was much earlier than it was for Fischer. I mean, Robert Byrne was 15 years older than Bobby. And what you come out of it is that pretty much, with the exception of Lombardy, who was really good when he was young. I mean, he was much stronger at 14 than Fischer was by, you know, he was a master. I mean, Fischer was, excuse me, maybe a little bit younger than that, maybe like about 12 or 13. Lombardy was definitely a stronger player. The thing with Fischer is you look at, he played in the 1955 U.S. Junior in Lincoln, Nebraska. He made an even score. He was rated about 1,800, and that was in 55. And that was in the summer. And let's say even by August, he probably wasn't that much stronger. And then you go forward 3 years exactly, and you're at the candidates tournament in Porter Rose, and he's qualifying, and it's clear he's like one of the top dozen players in the world. And you have to ask yourself, he went from 1,800 to let's say 2,600, just for a figure to use. That's like a gain of 800 points. And as we all know, from 2,400 to 2,500 to 2,600, the air gets thinner and thinner the further you go up there. So the question is, how did this happen? Well, Collins first welcomed Fischer into his home in 55. So, or is it maybe 56, I should say. It's around that time period. And the point is that that's where the great leap forward came. And what I think you see is that nowadays, of course, chess players have access to they have the internet, they have databases, they have computers. But Fischer had a lot of things going for him at that time as well. And there were a lot of strong players that were constantly coming through Collins' home. Collins had a huge library. There were correspondence players. There were tournament players. There'd be people showing games, people showing endgame studies. They'd be looking at opening lines. It was just constant chess in a way that chess players today, most of whom don't have access to a brick-and-mortar club, would find hard to believe. I mean, I think in some ways Fischer just opened the door to Collins' apartment. He just breathed in the air, and he just got stronger. And so I think that is the point in time where Fischer really, his real love for the game just blossomed, and where he just started to get stronger and stronger. And then at the end of 58, or even a little earlier, just say after the interzonal, that was when it was kind of like he had graduated from that school. He would still go there socially, but it was no longer the place he would go to every day. And that, in part, was because he was no longer in high school, for much longer. He's dropped out, I believe, in 59. And then one thing that we came across that really made an impression on me was at the Bloomington, at Indiana University in Bloomington at the Lilly Library, they have the John Collins papers. And there I found a bunch of training games between Collins and Fischer. And I also found training games that Collins played with Lombardy, that he had played with Weinstein, and Collins held his own. I mean, he was a 2,400-plus player for the most part. And I think that if you take in mind his physical handicaps, his understanding of the game was probably greater. I could easily imagine that when he played in tournaments and played 2 games a day, that, he probably was not playing as well in the second game because he just didn't have such a robust physique.
Makes sense, yeah. And you also mentioned in the book that in addition to Collins being, obviously, as you say, a strong enough player to play an instrumental role in that leap that Fischer made, he had one of the best chess libraries in the country at a time when chess books were not so easy to track down.
Very true.
Yeah, and Fischer obviously was just inhaled everything about chess. I mean, now it's like, yes, all the grandmasters, to get to their level, the elite players, they have to, obviously you have to study it, but with everything optimized now for tactics trainers and teachers and stuff like that, it's a different animal than the way that you had to sort of be a hunter to gather the information back in Fischer's day. So as you mentioned, this could have only happened in New York. Like there's this book called The Talent Code where they talk about talent hotbeds, where when you look at clusters of people who achieve great things in a field, they generally come from places where others did as well. And obviously there was no other Fischer, but he couldn't have done this anywhere else.
No, and it wasn't, Lombardy maybe was helped to a lesser extent, but one player who clearly benefited also from this chess salon, if you will, was Raymond Weinstein. I mean, nowadays most people remember him, for the sadness, that he had mental illness, that he killed somebody, that he's been incarcerated for over 50 years for the Hospital for the Criminally Insane in, I think, Randall Island in New York. But he was a great player. I mean, in 1960, he played a leading role on the team along with Charles Comey and Lombardy and Sadie and Mednes and Hurst that won the gold medal against the Soviet Union in Leningrad. He also played on the U.S. Olympiad team in Leipzig that won silver medal with Bobby and Lombardy and a great team. And then he also in that U.S. championship in 1960-61, he took third place. He could have played in the Stockholm Interzonal if not for his studies.
Yeah. There's so many chess players. I mean, when I had John Watson on, he made the good point that, like, I mean, there's obviously some genetic and environmental factors both contribute to mental illness, but it certainly didn't help matters that chess was such a tough go back then. And now it's a bit more comfortable.
Oh, that's a understatement. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the situation in 1960, you had Fischer, who was like a chess professional, but as we know from Endgame, from what Frank Brady was able to find out, he got some assistance from his mother, and then you look at Lombardy went into the priesthood. I mean, Larry Evans was real estate. Pal Benko, worked on Wall Street for a while. Reshevsky sold insurance, but he also had support from the ACF, and he also had Mrs. Piatigorsky as a patron. I mean, there was nobody that was just like earning a living purely from chess, and certainly, in Fischer's case, it helped that he was just by himself. And then I started playing in early '72. Situation was changing. That's when it really started to change, because then there started to be some individuals that earned a living from chess. But now there's just no comparison. I mean, if there were like one or two people trying to earn a living from chess in '60, I mean, the only ones that really earned a real living would have been people like Al Horowitz, who published Chess Review, and Kenneth Harkness. People that worked for the Chess Federation would have eked out a living. But by '72, during the Fischer boom, that changed dramatically. And of course now there's just so many opportunities. I mean, I would not be surprised if there wasn't, thousands of people now that earn a living, if not a full living, a living in part from chess in the United States.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Okay, and a sort of related question from a supporter of the podcast, Brian D'Souza. Brian asks if Bobby Fischer were alive today and in his prime, and of course this is the $1 million question, if he had access to the same resources as today's players, would he still be the best player in the world?
I think the answer would be yes. And the reason for that is, one, it was just like his total dedication to the game. I mean, he'd still be spending like 12 hours a day studying chess. And the other thing is also when he played at the board, he just gave everything. I mean, he didn't wander around, when it was his opponent's thinking time. And also the mental toughness. I mean, this guy just like, he wouldn't offer draws. He played a lot of positions that were, slightly worse for him sometimes, especially with black, even like in the late '60s and early '70s. And he would play these positions, to hold them and then to gradually outplay the guy and beat him. So I think the answer would be yes. The thing, though, is it's kind of interesting that Fischer, in his earlier years, he was very much interested in technology. And that extended even to after he won the World Championship. It was he that reached out in '77, and when chess computers were popping up, and he was very curious about them. He actually played a match or a series of games against one of them. But by the time he got to Iceland, and this is the very end of his life, he was like not, he'd been given chess base in the 1990s. I think the USCF may have even provided him with it at one time. But I don't think he really ever caught on to it. And Helgi Olafsson writes a couple times in his book, which is a really good book about the last years of Fischer's life, about how he would go over there and they would look at some games. And I kind of got the impression that it was like Olafsson was like, using the computer, and Fischer was watching. And I think there's one funny anecdote in there where Fischer was interested in some female players that were African players, and he'd seen their pictures, but he wanted to look at their games first. It was a typical Bobby. Right. And but one thing, if I could ask Fischer a question, I was always curious about. He was always worried about chess, being played out. I mean, that's why I brought out Fischer Random, and that was pretty much, from openings being overanalyzed. But one thing I'm kind of always been curious about was how cognizant if he about the other direction, with table base, with these 5, 6, 7 man bases that basically just play the position perfectly. And if he had ever realized that some of the games he played, like his game with Walter Brown, which was like at one point it could have been a endgame with no pawns, but with a couple of pieces for both sides. And some of the games from his match with Reshevsky, if he had ever gone back and looked at those games with table base, he would have been surprised that the assessments for the positions were different than what he thought, just using his own head. Yeah.
And I do think, the table bases from the endgame are definitely, they're perhaps a bigger threat to chess than to chess like in its current form than opening theory, because it seems like you can still avoid theory. It's easier to avoid theory than to avoid endgames, put it that way.
Yes, but I don't see Fischer playing the London system of fight.
Right, that's true. Yeah, he liked to fight. Okay, so a couple more questions. Well, yeah, 2 more questions I think on Bobby Fischer, and then reluctantly I think we should move on. So this is from Keith Kaiser. He says, Fischer's well known for his commitment to e4, but in the most important game in his career, he went c4. Do you know whether he decided this change all on his own, or was suggested by one of his seconds? That's regarding the Spassky match.
Well, in the Spassky match, what we know is that Lombardy was was Fischer's official second. He was the person that was listed on the program, and I would say that Lombardy earned the price of admission and more just by getting Fischer to play the third game. And Lombardy told me that I can't recall it now, but there was a match that some player had played in the 1850s or 1860s, and it was a famous player, and Fischer, of course, was well aware of the match and the games, and the player lost the first 2 games, and they went on to win the match and by a big score. And so Lombardy did everything he could to persuade Fischer to calm him down, and remember, because he was 2 down and he'd never beaten Spassky up to that point, but to continue on in the match. So to my mind, if Lombardy had never done anything else in chess in his life, and he did a lot of things, I would say that one thing, merited him a place in Chess Valhalla. Mm-hmm. But in the second half of the match, we know that another person came to play an important part, and that was Luboš Kovalek. And Kovalek was a very strong player at that time. In fact, prior to our big 3 now being in the top 10, I don't think that we ever had that before. I think there might have been a time that Hikaru and Gata, like maybe one was in the top 10 and one was like number 11. That would be Gata probably. But I don't think they were ever in the top 10 at the same time. So the first time this happened, though, was around 73, 74-ish, 73 maybe. Kovalek, he was like 26-15 or so, or 26-20. He was rated like number 10 in the world. So the United States actually had 2 players in the top 10. In fact, I think one of Luboš's great disappointments is that he never was able to play in an Olympiad with Bobby Fischer, and one could imagine if they had the 2 of them, and and then you picked the rest of them. I mean, there was Robert Byrne, was a candidate in 73, so he would have been a good choice because he was already in good form in 72, and you've had Benko and Evans and Lombardy and Reshevsky. I mean, they would have. I mean, no question about it, the Soviet Union would have been the favorite. But in those days when there weren't that many good teams in the Olympiad, in that sort of situation where it's more uneven, the teams that are competing, they would have only had to do good against the Soviets and the Hungarians and Yugoslavs and then just clean up against the rest, and they would have been in there with a fighting chance to take gold. Fischer, he kind of left, a little disappointment, but not playing in the Olympiad. But on the other hand, I think it was less than a month between when the match in Reykjavik ended and when the Olympiad in Skopje started.
Oh yeah, that's a quick turnaround for all the changes obviously that came with winning that match.
Right. So I would say that as far as both Kowalik and Lombardy went, I don't think they gave him any opening advice. Kowalik never has suggested as such. And of course, Lombardy was a great connoisseur of the English opening. If you go to Kevin Spraggett's website, and not a suitable website for minors, if you go to that website and you just Google Kevin Spraggett and William Lombardy, there's a nice tribute. This was done many years ago to Lombardy, and it kind of highlights Lombardy's expertise with the English. But having said that, I don't think it came from that. I think Fischer always just played the openings he did, and I think that he was intending to play. He had dabbled with the English here and there beforehand, but Ron Gross, who's a good friend of Fischer's since the late 50s, the LA Master, he said that before the 1970 USSR versus the World match, when Fischer thought he was going to play against Spassky, he was intending to play C4 against Spassky, and the novelty that he played with Queen A3 and the Queen's Gambit declined, that was prepared at that time. It was only right before the match that Fischer, agreed to play against Petrosian, because Larson, who had a brilliant year previous year, he insisted that he should be top board. Fischer had taken a long layoff, and Larson should be the one to play against Spassky, and certainly Larson did well enough. He scored 1.5, and then he beat Stein in the one game that Spassky sat out. So I think that opening choice of 1C4, it came from Bobby himself. I think for the openings, nobody ever told him what to play.
Yeah, I mean, he read every book he could get his hands on, and his absolutely astonishing memory is for chess games and positions is well documented in your book. All right, so one more question, and this one's from me, John, and I don't want to I feel like there's so much to talk about with Fischer, but I don't want to gloss over his mental illness and his anti-Semitism and all the things that unfortunately he's most known for outside of the chess world. But so you talk a lot about the Derek book. What was the guy's first name? Brad Derek book that maybe set Fischer on a trajectory of an increased sense of victimhood. And there was also, as you talk about, the fact that his mom was legitimately being investigated by the CIA for being suspected of being a communist. And of course, the Fischers were, the Russians were genuinely colluding against him. So, he probably had some preconditions for paranoia and mental illness, but it didn't help that he had legitimate conspiracies against him. So do you think it's possible, in an alternate universe, where he could have basically held it together, as it were, and been a functioning member of society and an elite chess player through the course of his life?
That's a good question. Of course, the thing you allude to, Bobby's mother being a communist, possibly a communist. She definitely was. She, at some point in her life, she believed, she lived in the Soviet Union, and that's in fact where Bobby's sister, Joan, was born. And she was, during the Second World War, she was, she lived in Portland for a short time, and lived in a red house, if you will, with other communist or socialist inclined individuals. And when Fischer was a young boy, Brady relates how she told him if the FBI answers the door, this is how you're supposed to answer. And she was not the only person. After Larry Evans played in Cuba in 1964, and after he did that, he went through Canada. That's how he managed to get there. And but the U.S. State Department found out that he played in he got some interviews. That's one of the reasons why Fischer didn't play in '65 was because he saw what happened to Evans the year before, and he didn't want any part of that. But to talk about Fischer and his mental illness, I think there's a great book on the subject, a very respectful book, a very insightful book, a very comprehensive work by Joseph Poneroto. He's a professor at Fordham University, psychobiography of Bobby Fischer. Usually I'm not a fan of psychological evaluation, especially when the two parties, the psychiatrist or has not met with the individual. But I think that Joseph did a really, really good job with this. He was aided by the fact that he had access to the Fischer family papers. These were donated by Russell Targ to the Marshall Chess Club, and they are also a treasure trove of games. At some point in time, hopefully these will be made available to the public. But Targ was able to use these papers, and he learned a lot about the Fischer family. And one of them was that Regina, Bobby's mother, her mother died in an asylum. So there was a history, they always say, genius or mental illness are like, second cousins or maybe first cousins or maybe even closer than that. They're right at those two ends. And I think that, Fischer did have his challenges. I think some of the things, for example, I think he was very sensitive to noise. I think this is a physiological thing. And I think that, he could hear noises that other people couldn't hear. And I don't mean like those kind of noises. Right. I mean just, real noises. Right. And so I think that, he was not your normal person, if you will, but I think he was within the spectrum of and I think that one thing to keep in mind is that he, I think he was always essentially a private person. And I think after that 1972 match, that was gone. And, he wanted chess to be respected. He wanted it to be recognized. And it was. I mean, he was on the front cover of Time and Newsweek and New York Times and everything. But when he went to the American Open in 1972, in Santa Monica, and he was just watching the games quietly, and this is something he'd done in New York for many years. All of a sudden, like, everybody, whether they were on the move or not, started moving over towards Fischer. Imagine 500 people are marching over towards you. They just want to see you. They want to meet you. They want to shake your hand. They want your autograph. I mean, he just freaked, and I not hard to believe. And then later in his life, in the 1990s, just so many bad things happened to him. I mean, he played the match in 92, and U.S. State Department said, you shouldn't be playing this match. And that was the match that sort of gave him his financial freedom. And the price of that was he did not attend the funeral for his sister, the funeral for his mother.
Because he couldn't travel back to the U.S., to clarify. Right, Go on.
And he also, there was a business with 60 memorable games. Gambit Publishing is like a great publishing firm, and the people involved with it are really first rate. And, John Nunn's like one of the great chess authors of all time. But in this one particular case, they did something they shouldn't do, and that is they tried to clean up his little, they changed the wordings and they changed a little of this and that, and you can go to Edward Winter's site and it's all documented there. And that drove him nuts. And just a little aside, the funny thing is those were like, for the most part, cosmetic things. But we have in the book an interview with Bernard Zuckerman where he points out that there's like chess mistakes in the book. And I don't mean by that analysis, because I think it would be pretty unfair to compare analysis that somebody did in the late 60s to to somebody turning on a computer now. I mean, you only have to watch some tournament on the internet and there'll be somebody that's rated like 1200, and all of a sudden they forget that when they turn on their computer. And they're like,
right, exactly.
Those guys are so weak. How could they miss that? No, what he was referring to was very specific instances in the book where Fischer will say, At this point I was playing tall, and I had a really bad record against it at this point. I didn't want to let him out, and so I played maybe a little less sharply than I would have, just to make sure that I was going to win the game. And he quotes the score between them, but it's wrong. He forgot a game. Or he mentions it at a certain point, and this could have been Larry Evans who did the introductions to the book, but Fischer's the author. I mean, it's his business. He's responsible for all the content in the book, and he would have had it no other way. I think he refers to the Argentinians. It might have been like the famous Göteborg variation where, I mean, maybe not, but it was just a reference to the Argentinian players that had settled in Argentina during the Olympiad that was held in Buenos Aires in 1939, and of course for Elaskasas, Austria, Germany, and then to Argentina, that was right. But there was another player, and it might have been Pilnik, and I think Pilnik, he immigrated in the early 1930s. So there were little mistakes like that all over, and Zuckerman had a big list for Fischer, and the last time they saw each other in 1978 briefly they shared a meal during the U.S. Championship in Pasadena. But Zuckerman told me that around 1973 or 1974 when he played in National Open, maybe he played in Lone Pine, he visited Fischer for a while, and he shared that information with Fischer. But somehow it was curious that Fischer, who always wanted to be really accurate, that when the book was reprinted, he never insisted that those changes be made. So that was just kind of an aside. But continuing on, I think the crushing blow, I think the last blow that just took the air out of Fischer was when his possessions were auctioned off. And we have a lot of research into why it happened, when the auction actually took place, and where his belongings ended up. And for the most part, I think most of the things that Fischer treasured, and these were really his treasures, they ended up in either in the hands of most of them, they ended up in two. Now they're in St. Louis at the World Chess Hall of Fame. They're with David DeLucia in Connecticut. They're with Larry Finley in Long Beach. And I think some of them are still with Pal Benko and maybe with Janos Rigo in Hungary. Almost nothing made it to Iceland. And that was despite the fact that Bob Ellsworth, who was the agent that Fischer had entrusted with caretaking his items, he bought a lot of the stuff back, and he took it, that is with the help of Harry Schneider, Bobby's physical trainer in the early mid-70s. His son went with Ellsworth to Budapest, and they brought all the things there. But it's kind of like for Fischer, it's like once those items were no longer in that storage facility, they had been tainted, and he didn't want them after that.
Right, and just to give the listeners the full story, or briefly, so what happened was his Ellsworth, who you mentioned, his friend, was charged with keeping up payment for Fischer's possessions that were in storage, and he missed a payment, and the ownership of the storage facility had changed, and suddenly the stuff, basically without Fischer being notified, was put up for auction. So
right, and the problem was that Ellsworth, when that change between Beacons to another storage facility was made, that new company, when they sent the billing out, there were two names that were the contacts for the to reach out to for the storage company, and Bobby Fischer was not on there. He had been using the name Robert Dallas James, one of his aliases, and the other person was Claudia Maccaro, and she had been a person, she and her husband, that Bobby had befriended in the early 1970s through the Worldwide Church of God when Fischer was a member, and they stayed close even after that ordination splintered in the late 1970s. And she, by the time she, I think even early 90s, she had already moved to Texas. So there was no way for that storage facility to contact Ellsworth, and he did what he could afterwards, but Fischer really turned on him, which was really a shame, because in the piece that you mentioned before by Lou Hayes, who is expert, was Texas-based for many years, but now living in rural Oklahoma, where he runs dog rescue. Very good man. Very good man. He and his wife, Susan, do a lot of wonderful things. He wrote this story basically about how Ellsworth and he helped put together Zita Rajani and Bobby, and it was really her that got Bobby to play again. But that's another story. But to return to your point about Fischer, I think he always had this history of mental illness in his family, and I think also he had like all these terrible things that happened to him, and together all these things, just not a good situation. And yet when you read about Helge Olafsson, his memories of Fischer, when you read about what Lou Hayes had to say, on most topics, Bobby was still very lucid, very a guy you could just talk to. But it seemed like there was always this need in his life to have this sort of I don't know what you would call it, but this kind of fundamental kind of worldview, if you will. And the Worldwide Church of God provided that for him at a certain point. And then unfortunately, much darker issues, Holocaust denier, very, very odd. You see even now that, and even at the time, that a lot of like white supremacist groups took Fischer as one of their own. And some of the literature he had was pretty nasty stuff, but it's always a little confusing also, because if you look at like his musical taste, he's like a Motown guy. He's like a soul guy, which is usually not on the playlist of white supremacists.
Right.
And then if you look at, a lot of his friends, it seems like his worldview was directed at the world at large, but his individual friends, they could be from any background, and he could get along with them. So, a little more complicated than you might think of. I mean, his views around the time of 9/11. I mean, he was pro-Palestinian. Well, you could be pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian. The United States is a free country, and he might have had views that were more extreme than some people have, but I would say that compared to like Noam Chomsky, I mean, he was still within the normal ballpark. But when he started, laughing and cheering when the people died, during 9/11, I mean, that's it's sick.
Yeah.
So, and then of course he was in bad health for a lot of the end of his life. I mean, he had medical conditions that should have been treated, and I would imagine, oftentimes when people are not in the best of health, they're not in the best mood.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll never know for sure, but I mean, his chest certainly held up reasonably well in his later match with Spassky.
Yes.
So,
well, it's funny you should mention that, because when you make a short list, I mean, chess is like, like boxing. It's like, what would have happened if this guy had fought this guy?
Exactly.
When they were in their prime, not Karpov, Kasparov, but, if Karpov could have only played Kasparov like maybe 2 years earlier, and then or a year earlier, what would have happened then? It would have changed the chess history for the subsequent matches if Kasparov had actually lost one. In the case of, Fischer, I think the thing to keep in mind, people point to the fact that he never lost a match. And in the case of Kasparov, he not only lost a match to Kramnik, but he lost pretty badly. He such that he was kind of broken. I mean, he actually made a couple quick draws with white near the end. Contrast that like with Gadakomsky when he played against Karpov, and he was like fighting to the bitter end, even though it might have been a hopeless situation. So on the other hand, Kasparov won like a zillion tournaments and played, all those world championship matches and just the breadth of his career. So when looking at Fischer, it's kind of like he's like the Sandy Koufax of chess. His career was short, but it was so brilliant. People really, they point to the match in in Sveti-Stefan and Belgrade, and they just say, this is kind of sad. Yeah, there was a couple good games. The first game was really nice, but Spassky really didn't put up terrific resistance. It was like Fischer was just painting, on a canvas. And there was the Rossolimo game. That was another good game. But again, Spassky was not like, top 50 player in the world at the time. But I would say a couple things. One, Spassky's rating, at that point in time, he's still a very good player. A lot of the reason why his rating went down was he was just lazy. I mean, he just liked to make, 12-move draw and then go off to play tennis. But if forced to fight, he could still fight. And I think that there was one of the PCA, GMA tournaments that he played that I remember he did pretty well. And I mean, when he had to, he still understood chess well enough, and he just needed to be motivated. But the other thing about that match I would point out is that was the first match to use a non-traditional, up to that time, chess clock. They used the Fischer clock, and nowadays time delay or time increment, those are like just normal thing. But they weren't at that time, and it was a real experiment. And Fischer didn't quite grasp how long some of the games could be with the time control that he had, and we document that in the book. But one of the games was almost 8 hours, and well, if you're raised on American chess, you play in weekend tournaments, you're probably saying, well, 8 hours? That's like no big deal. I play like 2 10-hour games in one day. Probably not when you're over 40, and probably not looking forward to it at that age. But for young players, it's not that big a deal. But it's not the same thing. And I'm almost certain that, for example, Kasparov, Karpov, Anand, Kramnik, Carlsen, none of those guys have ever played a game of chess, a single game of chess, that went over, say, like 5 hours. Maybe 6 maximum. But even that I kind of doubt. But that game went 8 hours. And anybody who's ever played a really long game like that knows that, things can happen. Your energy level can drop. You can get kind of groggy. And there was, in particular, that one queen in game where Fischer was like a couple pawns up and he didn't win it. I mean, that was like a marathon game. And Fischer was kind of just punch drunk at the end, I think.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't read too much into that match. I think when you're looking at Fischer's record as a whole, I think you just have to concentrate, really from like the late 60s to the match in Reykjavik.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a small sample, the one match, and it's not like he embarrassed himself. I mean,
no, not at all.
Yeah, he did win the match convincingly. Okay, yeah. So John, like I said, reluctantly, I feel like we should cover a couple other topics. Although, if you're up for it, maybe we should, maybe I should have you back sometime, because you've got such a interesting career on your own, and there's so much I'd like to ask you about, but. So let's start with the Mechanics Institute. So I reached out. One of the members named Sam Stolpe had emailed me, and one of the many people that suggested you as a guest over time. So he asked a question relating to this venerable chess club, saying the Mechanics Institute Chess Room is the oldest continuous chess club in the U.S., and you've played an important part in its development over the last few decades, including serving as the current director. Tell us a little bit about your time and ideas around the chess room, both past, present, and future. How do you keep a physical chess community together in the face of the rise of internet-based chess?
Well, that's a very good question, and I feel blessed that I have the job that I do. The Mechanics Institute Chess Club's been around since the founding of the Institute in 1854. I should say, first off, the name of the club, of the Institute, I should say, might throw some people for a loop. I shall state here unequivocally, I could not fix your car. Don't ask me to. It would not be a good idea. The term mechanics in the 1800s had a much broader meaning than it does today. It was pretty much any sort of skilled craftsman or artisan, so much so that, for example, like Andrew Holliday, who invented the cable car, he was a mechanics member. When the University of California at Berkeley was founded in 1867, 1/3 of the classes were actually held at the Mechanics Institute, like the drafting classes and things like that. And we basically came to be because the gold rush ended. I mean, as everybody knows, that was sort of the thing that put San Francisco on the map. And it was before they would find silver and what to do. All these very motivated, very educated people had come to San Francisco. You could just imagine. There was no train or plane to get you across. You had to go overland, or if you were wealthy, you could take a boat to Panama and cross Panama and take another boat to San Francisco. But it was a lot of very well-educated, very ambitious people, and they liked San Francisco. And when the gold rush petered out, they decided they wanted to make a go of it. And to do that, they thought they needed an educational institution. And so Mechanics Institute was formed, and they ordered books which were delivered by Pony Express at the time. And this institution is still going strong over 150 years later. The chess club was always part of the Mechanics Institute. When the first American Chess Congress was held in New York, and I believe it was 1857, the year later, a smaller but still very ambitious event was held in San Francisco by all the different chess clubs that were in the community, and there were quite a few. The Mechanics hosted visits from a number of famous chess players before 1900, including Zukertort and Gossip. But starting in the early 1900s, we had pretty much every world champion has been to the Mechanics that is world champions from 1900 to 2000. I think the only ones we missed were Botvinnik and Kasparov, but all the rest from Edward Lasker to Karpov were at our club. And it's located right in the heart of downtown San Francisco, which is both a blessing and a curse. Blessing because we're near where a lot of people work, and we're very close to public transportation, the BART and the Muni, which are the local transportation for people in San Francisco and the Bay Area. It's just 100, 200 feet from our club. Disadvantage is we have no parking. I mean, don't even try to park close to the club. Not a good idea. The club occupies the fourth floor. The Mechanics Institute library is on the second and third floor, and we have about 2,000 books and chess books in that library, and we have all sorts of periodicals. We have a complete run of the British Chess Magazine, Chess Review, American Chess Bulletin, chess, what have you. We've got it, and the library is always very good to the chess players. They are always buying new books. We have a budget of over $1,000 every year to buy them. So that's all on the plus side. And I started working there in October of 1998, and one of the better decisions of my life. And the club's really grown since then. In 1972, they started a weekly tournament on Tuesday night, and they called it the Tuesday Night Marathon. And the name Marathon was an 8-round tournament, 8 consecutive Tuesdays. They take a break for a couple weeks, and they start it up again. And that tournament is run continuously from 1972 to the present. And when I started at the Mechanics in the fall of 1988, the tournament was getting about 45 players. And, for a club tournament, that seemed pretty reasonable. But our last tournament that we had 143. Wow. And I think that's pretty likely to be the largest weeknight tournament in the United States. And you alluded earlier to the challenge of how do you get people out of their nice, warm, comfortable home in front of their big screen, computer, and how do you get them to a brick and mortar club? And in the case of the Mechanics, I think there's several things that myself and my colleagues, FIDE master Paul Whitehead, who tied for first in the U.S. Junior, closed with John Furwitz and Yasser Seirawan back around 1978. He's part of our crew. We also have International Master Elliot Winslow, who teaches our Saturday class, who teaches in Nick DeFermian's mechanics program that we have, for a free program we offer to schools in San Francisco. So they're the core of the group we have. And So what we do on Tuesday nights is we have a free lecture from 5:15 to 6:15. Anybody that's listening to this, if you're in San Francisco, you're more than welcome to come and listen to this lecture. Usually it's me that's giving it, but this coming Tuesday it'll be Grandmaster Sam Shanklin, fresh from a big result from a tournament in the Sunway International that was held near Barcelona. He's a frequent guest lecturer at our club. Daniel Naroditsky is another. Both of those young grandmasters, they played a lot in the mechanics in their formative years, and we have a couple other grandmasters. Vinay Bhatt, who doesn't play actively anymore. He's long been affiliated with the club. Jesse Cry and Josh Verdell, when they lived in San Francisco area, they would also be part of our club. And now we have a lot of players, grandmasters that will visit us for special events, and we had a invitational tournament last September with Conrad Holt, who now works for Google, who's living on the peninsula, and Parmesan Negi, the great Indian grandmaster and author of many fine books. They played in that tournament with Daniel and Sam. So it works out that we give the lecture from 5:15 to 6:15. Then the tournament starts from 6:30 and it runs to 10:30. It's a game in 2 hours, 5-second increment. I enter every game that's played in that tournament in ChessBase and put it on our website. It's like about 50 games every week. There's no truth to the rumor that I listen to the good, the bad, and the ugly theme song when I'm doing that.
Right.
But I've been tempted sometimes. But no, for the most part, I would say Alexander Elekine's observation that all players can create something of interest and beauty is true. Even sometimes lower class players will come up with some really terrific combinations. The difference between them and strong players is oftentimes just a matter of consistency. I'll make some light annotations to the game, and people seem to like that. It's the social atmosphere as well. A lot of people have friends there. The one thing that people would really be sort of stunned by if they came to this Tuesday night marathon is they would think they were like in an episode of Star Trek and they had gone back in time, because it's the age of the players.
Right.
Nowadays, if you go to a typical weekend tournament, I think it's not uncommon that 70-75% of the players are under 18. And in the Tuesday night marathon, partly by virtue of the fact it's a school night, probably only about maybe 20% max of the players are under 18. And because of the fact that it's just one game a week, a lot of older players really like it. And so I would say 20% of the players are over 65. And we've had players as old as the early 90s is playing it, and as young as like 5 or 6. The 5 or 6 is nothing these days, but early 90s, that's a little bit different. And they vary tremendously in strength. We have the last tournament had maybe 12 masters playing in it, but there were probably 12 players as well that were playing in their very first tournament. And one thing we've noticed recently is that we've gotten a lot of players from the business area of San Francisco, and the business, of course, would be tech. And there's, I think, about 80,000 tech workers now, and within about a mile of the mechanics. And we're getting a lot of them coming to play in our tournaments. Some of them were not tournament players when they were youngsters, but now a lot of their people they work with are interested in chess. And one thing I can definitely tell you today is the beginner today, that is the unrated player, and we shouldn't call them a beginner, they're not like what they were in the past. I mean, you have somebody that's an unrated player and they've been playing like on ICC or they've been playing on chess.com or where have you, and they've been using tactics, trainer and stuff like that. They'll play in their first tournament. Sometimes they'll get a rating of like 12 to 1600.
Right.
So it's a different situation. I sort of feel an honor and a privilege to work at the mechanics, because there's so much history. The tables that we have, which were recently refurbished, most of them date back to 1913. We have maybe a half dozen clubs that the Piotrkorsky family very kindly donated when Jacqueline died, that we also have our club in an anteroom in the corner. That it's our annex that we use for lectures and for analysis. And I think that one of the things that's missing oftentimes in weekend tournaments is there's not really time to do a postmortem. You're playing 2, sometimes 3 games a day. You do have to eat some point. The games are long, and a lot of times you're just like, you're just trying to conserve your energy. So there's not much chance to socialize or to analyze the games afterwards. But for the people that come to the Tuesday night marathon, that's a big part of it. And people kind of make it a destination. They come to the library, they check out chess books or even non-chess books. They go and hear the lecture, and they chat with their friends, they play their game, they analyze their game with their friends, and some of them will go out afterwards, for a meal or a drink, and so it's kind of like a ritual, a tradition, if you will.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a great community. So one follow-up question that comes to mind is, I've been on the board of the Pittsburgh Chess Club. I wasn't able to make enough meetings, so I had to step down. But the $1 million question, I think, for anyone involved with running a chess club is like, what's the primary driver of the finances? Is it membership base or donations, or how are you guys able to keep the lights on?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is it's a different model than what the Marshall Chess Club has. Anybody that's ever been to the Marshall Chess Club, which is like one of the most beautiful blocks of Manhattan, realizes that there's the club, and then they have 6 roughly apartments that they rent out, and those being on a great block in New York, those rent for a pretty penny. So that helps the Marshall to defray their expenses, although New York not being a cheap place, there's always challenges in that area. You look at another club like the Philadelphia Mercantile Club that I know that you're well aware of from back in your days then. Also a club with a rich history that goes back before 1900, but also, facing, sometimes, challenging situations. And I've been to the Pittsburgh Club, and I remember, they had a tremendous newsletter that was edited by Bob Dudley for so many years, and they had a fantastic library. And it's not easy because, you have a generational change. I mean, somebody that will work at that club for 30 or 40 years, and then they can't be there forever, and then you need somebody else to pick it up and to keep it going. And then of course there's always the problem, like how are you gonna pay the rent? And so the mechanics is really fortunate that it's not just a chess club, it's part of the Mechanics Institute. When you join the Mechanics Institute and you're an adult, it's like $120 a year. You have the use of the library on the 2nd and 3rd floor, and you have the use of the chess club on the 4th floor. You also have the use of, we have a events department, and they put on all sorts of events. They're going to have Daniel Ellsberg talking in just a couple days. And they have poetry readings, they have writers' workshops, all manner of different things are held through the Institute. It's a real cultural hub for San Francisco. But it's different than the Marshall. In the Marshall Chess Club, they could stay open all night if they wanted to, but we don't, because we have tenants from our 5th floor to our 8th floor of the building, and so part of the Mechanics budget is the 2 storefront properties we have, and the rent from the tenants. We also have a sizable endowment. People have been very generous to the Mechanics, and the Institute made some very, very savvy moves in the early 1900s, where they had owned some land near where the city hall is now, and they sold that. And so they've always had a cushion, if you will. And as a result of that, that's what keeps the dues at such a reasonable rate. Because, I mean, even just the chess club open 7 days a week, for $120 a year, it'd be a steal. But when you add in the library and you add in the events and everything together, the true membership cost would be like 3 or 4 times that. But because of the endowment and because of the rentals, the Mechanics is able to absorb that extra cost.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely helps, I'm sure.
Well, most definitely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure that, it sounds like I've never had the privilege. I actually lived in Oakland for a year and a half, but I never made it to the Mechanics Institute. But hopefully, I know we've had some guests that you mentioned, like Sam Shankland and Jesse Cry from the Bay Area. And I know we've got some listeners out there. So those who are not members, hopefully will support it. So last question, John. Thanks so much for your extreme generosity with your time. you're obviously, you've written amazing chess books. My copy of Accelerated Dragons by yourself and Jeremy Soman is my most dog-eared chess book of them all. It looks like it's been through a paper shredder just from my having studied it so much back when I was most active. And you review books on as well. So if you could give a few general improvement tips or suggest resources to our listeners. I mean, I know it's a rabbit hole. There's so much great content. But do you have any standout suggestions for people?
I would say that the first thing is that if you have a friend, if you have somebody that physically lives near you that's also a chess player, grab them with both hands, because that's, I think that when I was starting out in 1972, the Tacoma Chess Club, which, like so many chess clubs, said, it was just booming at the time. It had like 150 members in a city of, 175,000. I improved a lot just because I was, near a lot of other strong young players. Yasser Seirawan was from Seattle, but we saw him often. Eric Tangborn, my co-author for the Fischer series, who's been a lifelong friend. He also became an international master. We had Neil Salmon, several-time Washington State champion. It was like a strong 2,300 player. Probably could have gotten better if he traveled more outside the area. We had Paul Eggers was a master strength player. Bob Bungie was another player that was, close to master strength. We had a lot of good players, and just getting together and showing each other our games, you learn a lot from that. And that's something that is kind of low tech, but still really, really good, because you have to kind of explain yourself to the other players. They ask you questions, and then they may know things that you don't know, and you just kind of process things very quickly. So that was kind of my main training tool, because I came up obviously in an era when there were no chess computers. But nowadays there are just so many rich tools out there. I'd say one thing, I mean, everybody knows there are like all the tactics trainers out there. Everybody knows that there's a wealth of well-annotated games. But I would say that one thing that you could do that a lot of players could do that would be really helpful is listen to top players give commentary. And one of my favorites, and full disclosure, I've known Yasser Seirawan pretty much most of my life. He's a really good commentator, and by that I mean I don't expect him to analyze as well as a computer. It's just not going to happen. But his ability to explain things is really on a high level. I mean, the guy was twice a candidate for the World Championship, and he has a gift at explaining strategic concepts and ideas. And I would say that if you're going to really cut down to the nitty gritty, most people that are probably listening to this lecture have families, or they've got jobs, they don't have unlimited free time. I would say that if you want to make progress in chess, I mean, the first thing is you've got to play. I mean, if your goal is to be a stronger tournament player, at some point in there you have to play. And I would say a minimum of about 5 games a month is about right. That's about 60 games a year. And that could be one weekend tournament a month, or it could be playing a tournament that's a weeknight tournament at your club. And that should allow you, even a busy schedule, to not only play that game, which I would say should be at least about 4-hour playing session, 3 to 4 hours minimum. But it will also you'll have time to analyze it. And I would say that the order of business there is you play the game, you analyze the game with your opponent, you make some notes, you see what you saw, you see what he saw. You probably both saw a lot of ghosts as well. But then after that, and only after that, put it up to a computer. Don't skip that step. And then finally, if you have a teacher that you have access to, they can really save you a lot of time. They can cut through a lot of misconceptions. But I think you'll do better with that teacher if you put some investment in time beforehand, and if you actually look at the game a lot yourself and have specific questions that you don't know about, rather than have the teacher just explain everything to you. I think you'll benefit from that. And besides playing, and besides going over your games carefully, I think those are the two starter things. I think then the next thing is, you've got to spend some time on tactics. I mean, that's something that everybody pretty much agrees on. And I think it's a two-part process. And I think it's an ongoing one as well. I think first you need to find a book that kind of gives you a basic explanation of tactics, whether it's, double attacks or pins or skewers or what have you. And, you go through that book. So now you have some idea of what some of the themes are. And then you go through books that are on tactics. And it's a little bit tricky because you probably would be well advised to try to get the book on tactics in your hand first before you buy it, or you could do it online, but you want to get a selection that's appropriate to your skill level. So you don't, just as you wouldn't go out and try to bench press like 250 pounds the first day, so you wouldn't try to find like the most complicated book on tactics. You want to find something that's appropriate to your level, that's challenging but not overwhelming. So that's part of it. And ideally, it will have good explanations to what you've missed. Although a lot of times if you've missed one and if you kind of go through the solution, even if there's not a lot of explanation, just that process of going through it will kind of cement things. So first, a good book on sort of tactics in general, kind of explaining what the different tools are that are going to help you to be a real chess player. And then second, just practice. And I think as you get better, you'll find that you're going to again go back to books on tactics because there's that explain tactical themes, because some themes will be easy to grasp as a beginner, others will be more accessible to you as you get to be a stronger chess player. So I think even within a 10-hour time frame, I think somebody can play a 4-hour game. They can analyze that game, and they can invest 30 minutes a day in studying tactics. I think that's pretty much doable. Even for the busiest person, they can squeeze that tactics study time in, on their daily commute or before going to sleep or at lunch. They can find a way if they're committed to it. Then if you have extra time, I would say for class club players, I would say that there's different authors. I mean, I would say that there's a lot of players that write books for beginners, but I would say that there's not so many people that write books for players, like say in the level about 1,200 to maybe 2,000, and that's a huge territory. But I would say one player that one author that you should investigate, and again, full disclosure, this is a guy I've known for pretty much my entire adult life. I would say Jeremy Silman is a good author. His Reassess Your Chess, Amateur's Mind.
I was guessing that's where you were going.
Yeah, I would say those books are really good. I would say game collections are always a good thing, and you read reviews of people like Matthew Sadler, or you read books by Jacob Agard, and they're always emphasizing the need for like active training, that you don't want to read books passively. So what you can do with books like that is you could just take an index card and you could cover up the moves for one side and try to guess what they are. I mean, it's kind of a low tech. I mean, you can do the same thing on ChessBase and just so it doesn't show you the reply, and try to guess what it is. I think the thing is, there's a lot of tools out there. I think that you just need to find what will work for you. Chess is not like math or foreign language. It's a little different game. You've got a live opponent on the other side of the board that's trying to stop you from what you want to do. I think that there is no perfect method for any single person. I think to some extent it's a little bit trial and error. But if I could say one thing, I would say that I think that openings, I think that's, you hear so much talk about that, and it's probably not an accident. Like 80% of books are on openings. I think that it runs the gamut to like I remember Grandmaster Yerlinsky or like Quality Chess. They're always like, play main lines. These are the best moves. Don't play junk stuff. You will not progress in chess. You'll hit a stumbling block. At a certain point, you're going to have to take all the crap, if you pardon my French, from your chess game, and you're going to have to just play the real stuff. So that's one viewpoint. And I think that for ambitious players, for young players, I think those words ring pretty true. Having said that, I would still say that, until like 16 or 1800, learning the basic fundamentals of chess, learning the principles of opening play they should be front and center. And like, there's a good series by Andrei Yusupov that was published by Quality Chess that it's like a chess course, and it kind of handles openings for amateur players in a pretty good way. But there's another side to it, and I see this when I look at the games that people play in the TNM. And the first thing I would say is that the knowledge of opening theory now is so much greater than when I first started playing. You can't compare it. There's players that are like 1,400 that will like trot out the first 12 moves of theory. I'm always stunned. I'll see a player, and he'll trot all these moves out. Of course, he's 1,200, so you understand that probably he doesn't play the rest of the game the way he played the first 12 moves.
Right.
So, and the thing also we have a lot at the Mechanics is we have a lot of adult players that are new to the game. And so how realistic is it for somebody who's starting to play in the early 20s to expect to become a master? A few will do it, but not so many. And what about all those players who are like, 14 or 1,600 who got a family, a job, and they got a dog as well? Huh. And I mean, where are they gonna find the time to go do a 3-volume series by Parmesan Negi on a wonderful series on how to play E4? Maybe it's even more than 3 volumes. I forget. But the point is that I think for those players, playing the Smith-Morra Gambit and going through Mark Esserman's book, they're going to do just fine. They're going to do great, and it might be a lot more fun for them. I don't think they have to always play like all main lines. And I think that for that level of play, openings rarely decide the entire game. So wouldn't it be maybe better to spend more time improving their tactics, improving their endgame skills, which are usually ignored, just their general chess skills? And it reminds me of a tennis player that maybe some older listeners will remember. There was in the days before the magic rackets, there was a tennis player by the name of Roscoe Tanner. And if he were playing now, and he was, you could magically make him 20 years old, and he had one of the rackets they had now, it'd probably be registered as have to register with the police because he probably could kill somebody, right, hitting the ball. I mean, the guy had an overpowering serve, but since Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe couldn't beat him, you could kind of guess what I'm saying. I mean, he had big biceps, but he didn't have such strong legs. Right. You need to have more all around view to your chess development. So I would say, first, you got to play. If you don't play, you're not going to make progress. That is, if your goal is just to be a stronger tournament player. I think for some people who don't want that, that just want to have more understanding of chess, then it's something different. And that's perfectly fine. But I think for somebody that wants to play, you got to play at least 5 games a month. You got to analyze those games carefully and see what you're doing wrong. If you have a teacher, and I think that if not a full-time one, at least a part-time one can be very helpful in the process. I think you'll do better if you get as much out of those games before you come to them and ask them have more specific questions for them. You'll get a lot more from it. And you got to study your tactics. It's like the one thing that pretty much every chess teacher agrees on. And then finally, try to find some books that you like. I mean, chess should be a pleasure. I don't think especially for adult players, the cod liver equivalent of a chess book. I mean, if it's just going to sit on your shelf, it's not going to work. I think it needs to be an author that engages you, that you enjoy. Go to a tournament or go to your chess club if they've got a library there, or go online and read some reviews and find something that works for you. But definitely a combination of study and practice will definitely lead to improvement.
Great. Yeah. And I feel like you synthesized a lot of the advice that's been given generally by guests here. And I also, as longtime listeners will know, I tend to I can rant a little bit about how lower-rated players tend to overemphasize opening theory as opposed to understanding chess. But so, John, I don't want to take up any more of your time. This was amazing. It's a real honor for me to get to talk to you. As I said, I've been reading your books since my teens and a fan of yours. So, I'd love to talk about the Olympiads and stuff like that some other time. But for now, I think we should. We've broken the record for the longest interview. Peter Svidler and Hikaru Nakamura, I think we're neck and neck. But I think that we've eclipsed it, and I feel like we could keep going. But in the interest of time, we should wrap it up. So if anyone wants to reach you, John, is there a way that they can do so?
Yes, they can reach me care of the Mechanics Institute, and my email address is imwjd at AOL.com. So International Master William John Donaldson at AOL.com.
Okay, very generous of you to give out your actual email address. So thanks a ton, John. Anything else before I let you go?
No, that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Best of luck with the book. And listeners, obviously, please support this endeavor that IM Donaldson and IM Tangborn have done 6 years of their lives using their free time to unearth these resources while they're still unearthable. I learned so much from the books. So there's no one out there, no matter how much you think you know about Fischer, you will definitely learn something from reading these books. So I'll link to them in the show description, and please support these nice, talented authors. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
Special shout out to my PayPal and Perpetual partners. I spend about 5 hours a week working on the show, and while I love doing it, it can be hard to find the time. Without these people, the show would not be possible. So, special thanks to Adrian Gutierrez, Alex Pejas, Chris Wainscott, Coach Jay's Chess Academy, Chris Flanagan, Gary Andrews, I am Greg Shahade, Jason Dunbar, Jennifer Valens, John Fernandez, WGM Jen Shahade, Jens Green, Johnny McMenamin, Kelly Palmer, Krishna Gopala Krishnan, Macaulay Peterson, Matthew Tedesco, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Paul Sweeney, Peter Lux, Ricky Grijalva, Rob Lazorchek, WGM Tatyeva Abrahamian, Tim Seymour, Todd Bryant, Victor Vrankulj, FM Zhao Cheng, and Zhivko Stoyanov. Thanks a lot, guys. I will catch you next week.